When you look in a mirror, what do you see? Maybe you're charmed by the face that looks back at you and feel somewhat flattered by your innate association with it, never missing an opportunity to make eye contact when it appears in shop windows, the rearview mirror, or the glimpse you catch in the black screen of your phone before it illuminates. Maybe you see a face whose physical characteristics are exaggerated to the point of caricature. There is so much we could talk about on this subject. We could talk about the mutability of beauty standards, the very real delusion of body dysmorphia, why particular face shapes evolved, or something like that. Today I want to focus on the person we see when we stand in front of a mirror, though. You know that person as you, but is it? And if it isn't you, who is it? In 1926, Luigi Pirandello, an Italian playwright, poet, and author, released his book Uno, Nessuno e Centomila, or as it is called in English, One, No One, and 100,000. I highly recommend you check out the book. The way Pirandello's scenes unfold is natural and conversational, even in translation, and though I haven't read any of his other books, I suspect this comes from his experience writing for the stage. The book starts off with its narrator, Vitangelo, prodding his nose in the mirror, prompting his wife to ask what he's doing, playing around with his crooked nose. This seemingly innocuous, if a little rude comment, triggers a cascade of existential questions in Vitangelo. You see, up until that moment, Vitangelo didn't think his nose was crooked at all. In fact, up until that moment, he had thought his nose completely ordinary, or even that his nose was quite a good nose.
I have a mole?
Despite his wife's insistence that he was still a handsome man despite all of his physical imperfections, yes, he had quite a few more, according to her, the damage was done. The seed was planted. Vitangelo was thrust into an understanding that the him he knows and the him that everyone else knows are different people. This goes deeper than the casual observation that people perceive people differently. No, to Vitangelo, the him he knows and the him the world knows are distinct entities. This inspired an intense desire to be alone. Not the solitude that we might think of. No, that wouldn't be enough. He wants to be alone without himself. Alone with the him that only others can know. When reflecting on this, Vitangelo uses his wife's nickname for him, Genji, to draw a distinction between himself and the separate entity that the world interacts with. For her, my reality was in that Genji she had tailored for herself, who had thoughts and feelings and tastes different from mine, whom I couldn't have altered even slightly without running the risk of becoming immediately another, who she wouldn't have recognized, an outsider she could no longer understand or love. Unfortunately, I had never been able to give any sort of form to my life. I had never firmly wanted myself to have an individual nature on my own, both because I had never encountered obstacles that aroused in me the will to resist, and to assert myself somehow in front of the others and myself, and because my spirit tended to think and feel also the opposite of what it thought and felt the moment before. It tended, in other words, to dismantle and separate in me, with assiduous and often opposing reflections, every mental and sentimental formation. And then, finally, my nature was inclined to yield, to give way to the discretion of others, not so much out of weakness as out of indifference and resignation, in advance to the troubles that could then come to me. In short, Vitangelo realizes that, in a sense, he is less of a real person than the projection of himself that his wife is in love with. At least that person, as perceived by his wife, has some qualities that last, which might serve to define him. The perception of who Genji is doesn't constantly change based on new inputs. His worldview is not constantly being affected by new information and perspectives. Unless Vitangelo does something seriously out of character, who Genji is remains constant. Vitangelo can't be so sure about himself. He is constantly changing his attitudes and behaviors, even his own feelings, based on the feedback he gets from the people around him. In a sense, he exists as an inverted solipsist. Instead of believing that it is only his own existence that he can be sure of, he believes that it is only others' existences that can be assured, since his perception of himself changes so much more than his perception of others. Others, or at least the projections of others that Vitangelo interacts with, are like stars with fixed positions in the sky, dependable, predictable, and constant. If you've heard of René Descartes, or rationalism in general, you've heard of the phrase cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. This assertion, and the different versions of it found throughout Descartes' work, establish an ontological basement, a rock bottom to build up from. The world is full of illusions, and there are limits to our ability to interpret the phenomena around us, but at the very least, we know that we are thinking. We cannot be deceived about that fact. Now, that's great, but for our purpose of investigating what it is for me to be me and for you to be you, it's not that satisfying. I know I'm thinking, but what is the me that is aware of that thinking? Instances of people's cognitive ability diminishing after their brains are damaged by disease or trauma indicate that a Cartesian amness is dependent on the health of a physical brain. Further, I've never heard anyone make the claim that it is the base parts of the physical brain that are you. No one claims to be their autonomic nervous system. Maybe they should, since does a you need to function at full capacity in order to still be you? In the example of a very drunk man, who you are seems to vanish and return the next day. A little worse for wear, but still you. Either way, the special, individual you status seems to be reserved for the thinking parts, the self-reflective parts, the creative and abstract thinking parts. Regardless, if these parts are damaged, thinking activity ceases. Consciousness ends. And even if the rest of the body parts are carrying out their respective functions, the you is gone. The brain isn't the only body part that demonstrates that our ideas about us-ness are unevenly applied. This kind of thinking extends to other, less crucial parts of the body. No one grieves their toenails when they are clipped, or cries that their self is fundamentally changed if they skin their knee. If someone goes bald, and I'm speaking from experience here, they do not lament that a part of their body is gone, but that their image is changed. A puppet, which is the you that others know, now looks different, and you're afraid that you'll be treated differently as a consequence. You can't exactly blame people for feeling this way. After all, how much of what we think is us is just the feedback that others give us? Who is to say if we are anything more than the sum of the praise and criticism we receive? It's a common saying that pretty people don't have to have personalities growing up for people to like them, or that fat kids naturally become funny in order to gain acceptance. There are plenty of Reddit threads with a prompt like, "Formerly fat people, how did losing weight change how people treat you?" Or, "Former ugly ducklings, how did the experience of a glow-up change how you were treated?" I've always found the interesting parts of these threads to be how the transformed person's view of the people around them changed. If how you are treated by others is conditional on your physical attractiveness, I can understand being cynical or even resentful. I can also understand why someone would consciously or subconsciously develop a particular, and in some cases predictable, personality in order to fit into some socially acceptable archetype. I'm aware that these are tropes and aren't universally true, but still, I find them illustrative of the point that personality is not a fundamental part of us-ness. Rather, it seems that personality is something the self constructs in order to navigate the social world. Something people relish about moving to a new place is the opportunity to redefine themselves. That is, to present themselves to people in a new way. Some of this might be about finding a lifestyle that's more enjoyable for them, but a big component could also be that they don't like the role they had to take on in order to get by in their old life. Vitangelo says that it is only by constructing oneself that we can know ourselves. This makes sense. You build yourself in a particular way with certain end goals in mind. Let's say you want to be a considerate person, so you consciously or subconsciously emulate people in your life who always seem to be thinking of others. You want to be smart, so you read smart people books and listen to smart people podcasts. You want to be a good father, so you look to your dad or movies for examples, input, and maybe counterexamples of what it means to be one. And how do you think like a considerate person? Or a smart person? What does it mean to have the thoughts of a good father? It occurs to me that someone could project as super intelligent, but be insecure about their knowledge, constantly looking for reassurance or the ability to prove oneself in a debate. How many good fathers secretly carry doubts and insecurities about their love for their children, or think very little of them at all until it's time to help them out with their homework or dig out their car when it snows? Does the considerate person truly think of others first? Or do they feel compelled to prioritize them just to avoid rejection? The intention and the consequence are indiscernible, so at what point are our personality traits just projections or signaling to the world that this is the kind of person I am, so treat me accordingly? The distinction is even more obscure if the person carrying out the action has constructed themselves to internalize and automate the projection. At that point, is it you who is considerate, or a mechanism that you have consciously or subconsciously constructed? Is it you or your instincts, you or your conditioning? In a sense, by making yourself a certain way, you have unmade what Descartes would consider you, that is, the thinking part. If you can be constructed, what might the limits of that construction be? In David Hume's An Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding, he says, "Nothing, at first view, may seem more unbounded than the thought of man, which not only escapes all human power and authority, but is not even restrained within the limits of nature and reality. To form monsters and join incongruous shapes and appearances costs the imagination no more trouble than to conceive the most natural and familiar objects. And while the body is confined to one planet, along which it creeps with pain and difficulty, the thought can in an instant transport us into the most distant regions of the universe, or even beyond the universe, into the unbounded chaos, where nature is supposed to lie in total confusion. What never was seen or heard of may yet be conceived, nor is anything beyond the power of thought, except what implies an absolute contradiction." But though our thought seems to possess this unbounded liberty, we shall find upon a nearer examination that it is really confined within very narrow limits, and that all this creative power of the mind amounts to no more than the faculty of compounding, transposing, augmenting, or diminishing the materials afforded us by the senses and experience. When we think of a golden mountain, we only join two consistent ideas, gold and mountain, with which we were formerly acquainted. A virtuous horse we can conceive, because from our own feeling we can conceive virtue, and this we may unite to the figure and shape of a horse, which is an animal familiar to us. In short, all the materials of thinking are derived either from our outward or inward sentiment. The mixture and composition of these belongs alone to the mind and will. Or, to express myself in philosophical language, all our ideas or more feeble perceptions are copies of our impressions or more lively ones. If we are limited in our thoughts and imagination to alterations of the impressions we've received through our senses, it follows that the limit of how we might construct ourselves is within those impressions as well. That is to say, we can't construct ourselves in a way that is not a synthesis of the things we've experienced. Synthesizing and mutating concepts doesn't make new ideas, though. A centaur is quite literally just a man torso on a horse body. It's not a brand new thing. With reference to the 100,000 in the title of Pirandello's book, we can be so many different iterations of us, all at once and at different times, to ourselves and to others. When it is time to turn on the good father switch, you do so. When you need to appear smart, you break out the multisyllabic words. Alternatively, you probably dial them back when it's time to get loose with your friends. If you, like Walt Whitman, contain multitudes, then what does it even mean to be you? Surely we are all multifaceted, multi-personalitied individuals, but when you are really truly alone, and the Swiss Army knife personalities have fulfilled their purpose and been folded back in on themselves, what remains? What is the you that is left? If the body that others interact with is a puppet controlled by your mind, it might be helpful to think of what is you as the puppeteer, consciously and subconsciously signaling to and receiving signals from others. A problem with this analogy is that it assumes that your awareness of your stream of consciousness implies agency over it. Maybe you're not in control of the show. Maybe you're not even on stage. You might just be in the audience, watching it all unfold.